Bonsoir à tous et à toutes. Je suis ravie d'être parmi vous, même si je ne suis pas dans la salle. Je suis très reconnaissante à Jennifer d'avoir m'invité à cet symposium très important. I was really delighted by Jennifer's invitation, and I wish that I could be with you in person this evening. Unfortunately, I'm on travel to international meetings. I'm sitting on the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament. But if there's anywhere that I'd like to be, it's to be in with you talking about the protection of civilians in armed conflict. This issue is incredibly important, and what we've been able to accomplish over the last 20 years has been hugely impactful. Personally, for me, this has always been an issue that I've cared passionately about for both professional and personal reasons. I'm the child of refugees, and so the ability to make sure that the UN and the international community are doing all that they can in order to enhance the protection of civilians caught up in warfare has always been incredibly important to me. And that it coincided with the Government of Canada's commitment to take action on these issues the last time that we were on the Security Council was an opportunity that was, in the end, ultimately quite remarkable. I want to show you two of my prized possessions in life. So obviously, my husband is my most prized, and my family. But these two resolutions, they come pretty close, and they will be buried alongside me. This is Resolution 1296 and Resolution 1265. These were my two babies, and we wrote these as a member of the UN Security Council in 1999 and in 2000. And you can see Lloyd Axworthy and Bob Fowler and all the other colleagues who participated in the drafting of these two resolutions, which have been ultimately incredibly consequential. So Jennifer asked me to address a number of questions. So I'm going to go through them as best that I can, and I look forward to hopefully having the opportunity in future to hear what the conversation was like subsequently. So the first thing that Jennifer asked me was, what was our goal? What was the reasoning behind the Government of Canada pursuing the protection of civilians in armed conflict on the UN Security Council, in particular in the late 1990s? And I would say first and foremost, our goal was to underscore that states aren't neutral. And states have a role and a responsibility to play in helping to create a space for civilian protection and to promote respect for relevant international law. But to do that and to do it effectively requires active diplomatic engagement. You need to have the ability to draw on a range of tools. And we felt at the time that there was an insufficient sense of what were the tools that could be brought to bear and how could they be deployed consistently and with consequential effect. This had been most evident in the failure of the international community to deal effectively with a whole range of civilian protection challenges that had occurred, whether it was in Rwanda or Srebrenica, where we think that the UN Security Council had a special role and failed to acquit itself effectively, the refugee camps in then Zaire, and the paralysis that the UN was facing over Kosovo. Equally of concern to us was when there was no action, when the Security Council did take action, the mandates that it provided for were really only focused on convoys and not people. Roberta Cohen used to refer to this as the well-fed dead. And when the UN was engaging, it was piecemeal. So you think of some of the consequential resolutions. In 1992, we had Resolution 46-182, which was the seminal overarching resolution on humanitarian assistance, but it doesn't use the words protection anywhere in the document. In 1995, we had the series of resolutions dealing with the refugee camps and the situation in Zaire, subsequently Congo. In 1997, we had the debate on humanitarian assistance in the Security Council for the first time. And then in 1999, there was that series of resolutions and the one resolution on Africa and humanitarian action, and then camp security. But none of these were addressing the issues of protection directly, and they really were all around the ability of people to get access to assistance so that they could survive, but not necessarily thrive. So when Canada joined the UN Security Council in 1999, a key objective for us was to work towards a normative and operational change in international behavior. We wanted to identify practical ways to increase state, international organization, and NGO capacity to address the physical safety of people. In sum, we had a strong and ambitious political desire to demonstrate two things. One, concern for individual human security was directly relevant to international peace and security, and that the UN Security Council was one of the most legitimate organs in order to be able to pursue that agenda. And that second, human rights and humanitarian principles should be given more weight in international decision-making. We didn't think that they were going to win the day every time, but we felt that they at least needed to be given much stronger space in international decision-making. So the second thing that Jennifer wanted to know was, okay, so great. If that was what led Canada to decide that the time was right to be able to advance this issue on the Security Council, what then were the factors that enabled Canadian diplomacy to succeed in pushing it forward? And she also wanted to know what were some of the challenges that we encountered. So I'd say that there were many factors that I would attribute to our success in advancing the protection of civilians agenda, but maybe I'll highlight 6 in particular. First of all, we had support from the highest levels of government to be bold. Lloyd Axworthy, as the foreign minister, was incredibly committed to this agenda. The prime minister and the cabinet was supportive, and that trickled its way all the way down through the department. We also at the time had a very small group of young in-house experts in global affairs who weren't jaded on the possible obstacles that we might face in trying to drive this forward. At no point did anyone ever tell me that I shouldn't be trying to pursue this, and at no point did anyone tell me that I couldn't have the resources to hold a workshop, and I ever only got helpful and constructive feedback when I was trying to draft the resolutions. David Angel and I, David, who was in New York at the time, and I was the person at headquarters that was developing the strategy and the resolutions together as a tag team, we really were only given positive reinforcement to be able to pursue it. The third factor, we had a very clear and deliberate diplomatic strategy, and we were ruthless in how we pursued it, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. The fourth is that we had incredibly good timing. At that moment, when we were bringing this forward in 1999, there was a convergence in the UN Security Council, in part because of the atrocities that were occurring in Kosovo and the fears of what could come. There were the atrocities that were occurring in Sierra Leone. There was the ongoing crisis in Timor-Leste, and at that moment in time, there was about to be the delivery of the reports on the UN's failures to act in Rwanda and in Srebrenica. Those 2 reports were about to be forthcoming. The fifth factor in our success, I would say, was the makeup of the council itself. The non-permanent members of the council at the time, it was a very favorable configuration. We had Slovenia, we had the Dutch. There were a number of other colleagues that really enabled the space to be one that was ripe to be able to move this forward. I would also say that the P5, I think, did not entirely appreciate, although I'll come back to that, but I think initially they didn't entirely appreciate how deliberate we were going to be, and they didn't fully understand the whole of the strategy that we were bringing to bear. And when you look at some of the language in the resolutions, I know I often pinch myself that I can't believe that some of the paragraphs that we put in, we'd actually anticipated as a negotiating strategy that we would lose those paragraphs, and we're amazed that some of the language actually was able to make it through. And of course I credit the very skilled diplomats in the Canadian side for being able to do that. But I think the P5 also didn't fully appreciate what it was and how consequential what we were trying to achieve was going to do. Sixth and finally, I would say we also were able to secure the active engagement of international organizations, civil society partners, especially those with credible field experience. Without that, it would have been very hard for us to be able to come forward with the evidence base that we ultimately did, which was compelling in driving forward the elements of the Secretary General's report. So in terms of the challenges that we faced, I would say some of them are going to be obvious. It was a serious culture change for the Council to address protection questions. As I said at the beginning, it had really focused more on the delivery of assistance and not the protection of people. While I say that we managed to get forward language through the P5 that surprised us a bit, you shouldn't mistake that for meaning that it was smooth sailing. It was very difficult negotiations. The P5 were notably anxious because of questions related to sovereignty, which I would say is the second major hurdle that we had to overcome, which was arguments that the issues that we were bringing forward were not of shouldn't have been the purview of the Security Council, or that we were seeking to undermine state sovereignty, or that we should be careful not to unduly tie the hands of the Security Council because it may have to deal with issues in future years, and so this agenda shouldn't do anything that would mitigate its freedom of maneuver in future. But let me circle back to explain what was the strategy that we ultimately pursued, because I think that will help you to understand how we overcame some of those challenges. So initially, we designed a 2-year strategy. So really, there was our preparations leading up in the months before we got on the Security Council. Then we had a very deliberate 2-year strategy while we were on the Council, and then a follow-on kind of 3 to 5 year strategy of what we would do and how we would maintain the momentum once we were off the Council. So for the purposes of the 2-year strategy, the goal was really to provide the evidence base for the protection of civilians issue and showcase how it was relevant to the work of the UN Security Council. And the first thing that we were going to do was we were going to get a comprehensive report by the Secretary General in order to lay out the question transparently for the Council members and member states. The second was bringing the P5 and the non-permanent 10 on side with the objective of adopting a set of resolutions, thematic resolutions, which ultimately became 1265 and 1296, which would then, we would then use those to anchor thematic resolutions to then systematically ground them in every single country-specific context that came forward, whether it was a briefing of Council members on a country situation or in resolutions. So for example, in the context of Sudan, which the Security Council at the time was refusing to deal with as a Council issue. Ultimately, we were able to use operative paragraph 10 of Resolution 1265, which basically says that the Security Council commits to act when humanitarian assistance is being deliberately obstructed or civilians are being deliberately targeted. And we were able to use operative paragraph 10 to convince the Council to say, we're not saying that action is required at this point, but at a minimum, you should be receiving a briefing on the Sudan. So we were going to use the 2 thematic resolutions that we intended to put in place, and why 2? Because we were going to have 2 presidencies, and we intended to use the report of the Secretary General to give us the baseline. Then we were going to use each of the resolutions anchored in our presidencies to be able to drive the agenda forward, and then take the thematic elements and drive it in every single country context. The end goal was really to make sure that we laid enough groundwork in the 2 years, in the 24 months that we had as a Security Council member, that it would result in longer-term Security Council behavior change, especially in the design of peacekeeping missions and in sanctions regimes. That was notably what we were trying to target, to make sure that how those missions were designed took into account civilian protection, and that for every sanctions regime that was developed, the potential for unintended humanitarian consequences would be taken into consideration, and then the other additional elements, so related to conflict prevention, hindering hate speech, all of those other elements, we were trying to build in the structures for that. So in order to do that, we had to lay we did a ton of behind-the-scenes groundwork and building the evidence base. So, for instance, we paid for and convened a series of workshops around the world involving the most knowledgeable experts in the field of civilian protection and humanitarian action. And we made sure that the pen holders from the Secretariat were invited and participated in each of those sessions. And we did that because we knew that the Secretariat would never have been able to afford to do something similar and gather that kind of evidence base. We also undertook capital-based démarches to engage substantive experts. So we weren't going to just leave it and these are my colleagues, so I could say that now. I couldn't have said it then, of course. But we weren't going to leave it just to the New York-based UN Security Council experts. We wanted to go to their capitals directly. We actively and regularly engaged the P5. So we were very transparent about what we were trying to do. Whether or not they always fully seized it is a different story. We also aggressively used and introduced innovations. So, for example, we leveraged the new mechanisms like the area formula meetings to bring in expertise. We created opportunities for unprecedented exposure for the UN Security Council members to humanitarian and human rights experts. I know today it will sound strange to you, but for the first time ever, we enabled the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, at that time Mr. Samaruga, and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, to speak before the UN Security Council. Up to that point, neither the president of the ICRC, nor the High Commissioner for Human Rights, nor a number of other humanitarian experts had had the opportunity to directly engage with the UN Security Council. And the last thing I guess I would say in terms of our strategy is we had the long view in mind. As I mentioned at the outset, it wasn't just the 24 months that we were going to be on the council, but we also had an eye to the 3 to 5 years that would follow. So both in terms of briefing the colleagues that were similarly minded to us that were coming on the council after, but when we left the council, we developed a medium and long-term strategy that was divided into initially one 3 to 5 year plan, but ultimately it was 2 5-year plans in order to maintain momentum. So the focus for those follow-up plans remained in the first instance on the UN Security Council, but we also targeted regional organizations, the G8 at the time, the Commonwealth and the Francophonie, and in each instance, we made sure that the language that we had been pursuing and the ideas in the council made its way into those other forums. And that included, for example, in working with regional organizations, we worked with the African Union to help them to create the African Union Special Advisor on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Worked with the African Union to include language in their own doctrine around peacekeeping. And we did the same thing across the board. So again, very deliberate, very systematic in what it was that we were trying to pursue in order to have the kind of culture change, deep culture change that we were hoping to be able to achieve. So the third thing that Jennifer asked was, okay, so yeah, you had an idea, how did you pursue it, and then what do you think the most significant achievements were that you were able to secure by pursuing this? I would say first and foremost, in a remarkably short period of time, the protection of civilians in armed conflict agenda really changed the nature of the discussion within the Security Council, and more broadly amongst the wider membership of states, who really started to understand that their credibility was tied to how well they were seen to address these concerns. At that moment in time, it didn't always mean that every one of them believed it, but they certainly knew that they need to be seen to be addressing protection concerns. Now, there's a cautionary note in all this. It's not been a panacea. While we've made remarkable strides over the last 2 decades, I would say in recent years we've also seen very disappointing pushback. And on the most serious cases, like Syria, where the Council failed for a long time to engage, and where other subsidiary organs needed to be engaged, like the Human Rights Council, in order to launch the Commission of Inquiry. We saw the Security Council fail to engage in places like Sri Lanka. We also need to address some of the legitimate concerns by people who believe that some of the mandates that have been developed over the last 2 decades as a result of the POC resolutions are really hard to deliver. And there's also multiple interest groups. And so there's the folks that believe in the protection of civilians armed conflict agenda, there's the children in armed conflict agenda, there's the women, peace, and security agenda. And while these are all complementary, there is the risk that with these multiple agendas, they're not always pulling in the same direction. They're not always as coherent as they could be. And there is sometimes the risk of a diffusion of effort. And so while initially, in the first couple of years, it might have been more, the progress that we made might have been more in what the Security Council said than what it did, I would say that over the last 20 years, we have had a number of successes. So let me run through a few of those. The first would be that a majority of states do believe that civilian protection is a key consideration in matters relating to peace and security. And that is a fundamental change from what the case was before. Second, all UN organs and agencies, funds and programs have sought to improve their capacity to be responsive to protection challenges. Again, it's not a panacea, but this is something that they all understand that they need to be able to address within their organizations and in their training. Third, we've seen very concrete changes in the design of sanctions regimes and in how peace support operations are designed, developed, and then operationalized. We have the ability, due to the resolutions, 1296 in particular, to use force to protect civilians that are under threat. This is a fundamental change than what existed prior to 1999 and 2000. Every single peace operation since 1999 has included specific civilian protection provisions. That's a success from what we were before. We'll no longer be able to have a situation where peacekeepers in the field can say that they didn't have the authority to be able to engage. Whether or not they had the capacity is an important consideration, but it isn't because they didn't have the authority from this UN Security Council to protect civilians that they are prevented from doing so. I would also say all UN Security Council mandated sanctions regimes have included measures to mitigate unintended humanitarian consequences, although we have much more work to do on that part, particularly as it relates to counterterrorism provisions. But nevertheless, every set of sanctions over the last 20 years has had measures to address unintended humanitarian consequences. Another success has been that special representatives of the Secretary General and UN country teams are doing better at regularly assessing, monitoring, and reporting on the implementation of protection of civilian mandates. And they've been getting much better at identifying smart practices. I would also say that there's better training for those who are deploying. For instance, I was able to attend one of the more recent UN senior leaders courses, and I was really pleased to see how protection of civilians has been integrated within the senior leaders course. This is the course that's delivered for people who will be deployed as SRSGs, DSRSGs, heads of country teams. They are being told quite deliberately that they must have knowledge and understanding and an appreciation of how to address civilian protection concerns. There's some progress being made with the Secretariat in being more proactive in providing the UN Security Council with specific actions that it could consider in geographic specific contexts. I think this has also been helped with the recommendations that were made by Michael Keating after the Sri Lanka report, and then the subsequent follow-up through the Rights Up Front initiative, which I'm sure Jennifer's going to talk much more about. Another success is that the Council has a dedicated working group on the protection of civilians, which the UK chairs, although I would say that it's meetings have been kind of up and down over the years, but there is a working group that looks at protection of civilians issues. There's also the Friends group that exists in New York and continues to be an advocate on these questions. We've also seen subsequent UN Security Council resolutions building on the original protection of civilians. So from 1265 and 1296, we had 1674 in 2006, which gives priority to protection in multidimensional peace operations and has strong language on SGBV. Or Resolution 2286 from 2016, which focused on attacks against medical personnel. We've also seen protection issues advanced in a subset of issues that are mutually reinforcing but part of this wider agenda. So on the child protection front, for instance, Resolution 1612, which is the naming and shaming of those that use child soldiers. We've seen much better language also on gender, SGBV, HIV/AIDS specialists being included as part of child protection measures. There's measures around safety of aid workers, on camp security. And in the last 6 months, it's been interesting to see Poland advance work on disabled persons requiring protection in armed conflict, and Malaysia focusing on missing persons. These latter two, Poland and Malaysia, I think are particularly interesting for several reasons, not least because of who was driving these forward. The fact that non-permanent members wanted to be able to demonstrate that they were further advancing the protection of civilians agenda. But also what's interesting to me is that they're focused on very granular elements of the protection agenda, which I like to believe anyway, implies that the broad framework is now so entrenched that the elected members are really focused on fleshing out subsidiary and subsequent elements. I think I simply couldn't have imagined 20 years ago that when we were laying out the framework justifying action on civilian protection, that we would have seen that whole list of achievements able to occur. Now, that having been said, there are still a lot of challenges, and there's a lot more concrete action that we need to be able to take. So despite the progress that we've made, as we know, and as I mentioned, deliberate attacks against civilians in situations of armed conflict persist, as does political violence. And a lot has to be done still to bridge the gaps that continue to exist between the principles that states are espousing, including in the Security Council, and the actions that council members are taking. But this is a profoundly practical and doable agenda. There are many additional measures that can be taken to continue to improve the way that the UN system works to enhance the protection of civilians and bring genuine relief to people who are in desperate need. Amongst those things, I would argue are we need to better define trigger mechanisms for Security Council action and engagement, or at least the Council needs to comment when civilians are clearly at risk, but when there's no existing peace support operation deployed. It may not even be an issue that's on the Security Council agenda. Now, I know that that last one is especially tricky, but we cannot be in a space where actions are clearly happening in a country, civilians are clearly in distress, and the Council doesn't at least convene a briefing and make a statement to the media. A second area where I think we need to continue to make progress is we could look at the Security Council adopting specific and time-bound measures so that it's not open-ended and there would be an ability to have milestones, for instance. The Security Council could better exploit things like commissions of inquiry. They could have experts panels. The Council could deploy letters to parties in conflict around protection of civilians. They could deploy UN Security Council envoys. There could be more use of preventative deployments. We haven't really seen preventative deployments in the last 15 years. I think the Security Council could also better respond to the so what's next when parties don't respond to its hortatory resolutions or when parties flout arms embargoes, for instance. The Council could also better back UN country teams. They could do better at enforcing and monitoring measures that they've put in the resolutions around protection of civilians, and they could be much more vigilant in post-conflict contexts. I would say also, and it's a gentle nudge to our colleagues in the UN Secretariat, that they have to continue to remain proactive, especially now when you have a council that is far more constrained, much greater difficulties in getting issues to move forward on the council. The Secretariat there has a role in being proactive in identifying the kinds of constructive and specific actions that the council might be able to take in geographic specific contexts, and also in leveraging the Emergency Relief Coordinator as a voice for these issues. You might also see a UN Secretary General's bulletin issued, where clear expectations could be issued on how he believes these issues need to be addressed across the system. We could also see better training, and I know this is something that the new folks within peacekeeping operations are working hard on, but better training and scenario planning for troop contributing countries and police contributing countries, especially to assist national authorities with their curricula, their pre-deployment curricula. And so while it's now acknowledged and the point's been made to the UN Security Council that protection of civilians is important, I think we're still seeing some struggling happening when it comes to the implementation of the mandates. So we say the mandates have to happen, but we need probably much greater focus on mission planning, intelligence, and of course appropriate resources, configuration, and equipment being given to peacekeeping missions that are given a POC mandate. There's also a role in clarifying the roles and responsibilities, the opportunities of regional entities that are being deployed, what's the accountability vis-a-vis a protection of civilians mandate, particularly if they're both deployed in the same areas of operation, and make sure that we're also thinking about the cross-border dimensions of the protection of civilians and the challenges around cross-border dimensions for protection challenges. Okay, so that's a lot from me. Let me just say again that after 2 decades, we've seen remarkable progress on an agenda. We saw that we've seen the groundwork laid, the framework that we had hoped could be in place has taken root. We've achieved a great deal. I think we've seen credibility enhanced. But now we have all of these opportunities, and I've flagged a few of them for you to consider in the context of your follow-on conversation of where we can do even more. Now is a difficult moment geostrategically. The ability of the Council to move forward on some of these issues in the way that it may have done in past years is, as I suggested, much more constrained. But we must continue to ensure that this remains an area of focus because sadly civilians continue to be under threat. I really couldn't say thank you enough to Jennifer for convening this conference. I think it is timely. I think it's an important opportunity for us to reflect collectively as a community that's cared about these issues and to continue to refine our efforts, recalibrate, and think about how we can continue to see advancements made in the future. So thank you once again for inviting me, and I hope that I'll have the opportunity to join you in future.
I've asked our panelists to reflect on, with that normative groundwork set through resolutions and a very loose framework, how does an agenda like this come to life? How does it get reflected in the United Nations as an organization, which we've asked Regina to reflect on in terms of peacekeeping and other elements? But also, how did the protection of civilians on the ground evolve in these 20 years? What does it look like now in different capacities? What have been the challenges? What have been the achievements? I think it's really important in a context as hard as ours to shine a spotlight on what some of the concrete achievements have been, because I think we can all wallow in current challenges. So I hope we can have a balanced discussion. So I'm going to give each of our panelists about 12 minutes to address the different questions I've set for them. I'm asking them to come up to the mic because we are recording this, and then we will open it up to discussion. Regina, I've already introduced you, so they know who you are. And please, if you could come and share your thoughts.
Good evening, everyone, and apologies for sneaking in late. I'm really happy to be here with you to talk about this. If I had been introduced, then I would just want to sort of caveat that I do represent UN peacekeeping operations, which is only one small part of peacekeeping, of the UN as a whole. And so in discussing this, I think it's important to remember that the UN as a whole serves in many different protection roles. There are many different protection mandates, and even in UN peacekeeping, protection of civilians, POC, which I lead, is one protection mandate. We also have mandates on child protection, conflict-related sexual violence, and the human rights mandate, all of which overlap with but are different from protection of civilians. So I think that was fascinating to hear and sets the scene really well, because it shows how far we really have come in these 20 years. It's a good reminder because in addition, so in 20 years ago, POC was put on the agenda of the Security Council through these great efforts. But it was also when we had the first explicit mandate for UN peacekeeping operation to protect civilians, to use all necessary means to protect civilians. And that was the mission in Sierra Leone. And since then, we've had 16 missions so mandated. Today there are 7 peacekeeping missions with POC mandates, and that covers approximately 95% of all peacekeeping personnel, because those are big, multi-dimensional peacekeeping operations. So just to give you a brief history in terms of the normative framework on POC and peacekeeping, for the first 10 years of that 20 years, there really, the practice was leading in the development of POC. It was colleagues in the field who were addressing situations as they arose, who were really crafting what it meant to implement this POC mandate from the Security Council. In 2010, we introduced the first POC operational concept, which pretty much still holds today, the general concept. And so the way we conceive of protection of civilians, POC, in UN peacekeeping, is as a whole of mission, integrated, coordinated approach. So there's often a misconception that protection of civilians in peacekeeping is a military activity and it's about the use of force to protect people. That is just one element of the whole approach. And so we are constantly trying to remind of this comprehensive approach. The operational concept also introduced what we call the 3-tiered approach to POC. These are non-hierarchical tiers, which is confusing. They are not mutually exclusive, but mutually accommodating. The first tier is protection through dialogue and engagement. The second tier is provision of physical protection. And the third tier is the establishment of a protective environment. So in these tiers are all the different activities and things that a peacekeeping mission will do to protect civilians. And at different points in the cycle of a mission, different activities will be most relevant. So that concept has pretty much been validated and held for the last 10 years. It was codified in our 2015 policy, and then recently we just released the 2019 revised policy, which is mandatory guidance for our peacekeeping personnel in the field of how to protect civilians. So just to say that in that process of revising our policy, we consulted with a lot of our partners and friends and people in the field about the best way to do this. And one thing that we really learned was the need to have consistency across our peacekeeping missions, but also the need to have the requirement for flexibility, because our peacekeeping operations operate in very different contexts, and even one peacekeeping operation, take for example MONUSCO in the DRC, faces so many different situations in different parts of the country. So there needs to be a lot of flexibility in how you can protect civilians and what you do. So just a few things to highlight from our new policy, because these are the things that we see as going forward our priorities and areas of emphasis. And they're very much, again, responding to the feedback we've gotten from all of our personnel and partners. The first is the primary responsibility of the host state. So peacekeeping is mandated to protect civilians where the host state is unwilling or unable to protect, but that primary responsibility is always first and foremost with the host state. Secondly, as I mentioned, is the whole of mission, comprehensive, integrated approach. We can't emphasize this enough. Really, we need everyone, peacekeeping personnel, to understand that they all play a role in all the different tiers and all the different activities in different ways to protect civilians. Third, we're trying to continually emphasize more dialogue and engagement, which I mentioned is the first tier. This is in line with the Secretary General's current prevention agenda. What we want to do is not reach the point where you need to use force, and so to prevent. And this includes everything from aligning our protection strategies with the mission's political strategies, because they often engage with at the highest levels on peace agreements and political agreements. But it also includes engaging in dialogue with armed actors and encouraging them to minimize, if not cease, violence against civilians. So that's one area. Another area we are increasingly trying to emphasize, and this is very much, we benefit from again, the advice and experience of many of our partners, is to emphasize civilian harm mitigation and the do no harm principle. Peacekeeping sort of starts from the point of an assumption that we are protecting civilians from an external actor, but we have come over these years to realize that peacekeeping itself, we can cause harm to civilians, either directly or indirectly. And so we need to be more aware of that and build into all of our activities from the beginning this principle of doing no harm. And then finally, as is happening in probably all of the UN, but certainly peacekeeping, we have an increased emphasis on performance and accountability. These days, there is even more pressure from member states to demonstrate that we as peacekeeping are meeting the expectations of us. And so we, again, are trying to make it clear that this is not only for the military, this is not only for the leadership, this is not only for the person on the front lines. This is for everyone in peacekeeping across the whole mission, from top to bottom, all the way up to the Undersecretary General for peace operations. So I think, as we've gone through previously and now, the achievements we've seen in the normative agenda have been tremendous over the last 20 years. It's really, we take it as the starting point now that one of the strategic objectives of peacekeeping is protection of civilians. That is pretty much, as I say, the starting point. We have the buy-in on that from the Security Council, from member states, from troop contributing countries, and peacekeeping personnel. So that's real progress in 20 years. In addition to the normative agenda, we've seen a lot of achievements in practice. I appreciate that we should focus on those more. They're not always as visible as our failures and our challenges, in part because prevention is a difficult thing to demonstrate. Successful prevention, it's proving a negative. Something didn't happen, it's the counterfactual. So we do struggle with articulating that and seeing that, but we know that it's there. And I'll just give one example from my personal experience, which is the case of South Sudan, which at the time, in 2013, when the war broke out, I was serving in the mission, and it is, undeniable that by opening the gates of the peacekeeping missions and the bases across the country, the mission was able to protect tens of thousands of civilian lives. Now, the situation that remains today is a bit more complicated, but at the time and while the war was raging, that was a huge achievement and a huge success. And having been in the mission, I can say that was only possible because of this normative agenda had achieved so much. We all knew in the mission that our primary responsibility was to protect civilians. POC was the purpose of that mission. So that's just one very visible achievement, but there are many more. All of our missions are, every single day, peacekeeping personnel are protecting thousands of civilians, very different contexts in very different ways. However, coming to the challenges, it's just simply a fact that peacekeeping, we cannot protect everyone, everywhere, all the time. It's not possible, and we have to manage those expectations. We have to manage them coming from the Security Council, who often tell us to do it, expect us to be able to do it. But also we really need to do better at managing those expectations from the local communities, because they rely on us, they see the blue helmets, they often expect what we can do, and sometimes we should do better, but sometimes we can't. And so we need to do better at communicating what we can and cannot do, and better working with communities to improve the protection that we can provide and improve their situations on the ground. But in addition to managing expectations, there are lots of other challenges. I won't bore you with a very long list, but just to name a few. The first, I think that was touched on also by the previous speaker, is host state responsibility, and particularly where host states are unwilling to protect civilians and or unwilling to support peacekeeping to protect civilians. This can take all different forms, and the worst form is, of course, where the host state itself is posing the threat. So where a government is the threat to its own civilians is a very challenging circumstance, and one we find in several of our peacekeeping contexts. So in those contexts, we certainly require the influence of the political influence of member states and of the international community on their fellow member states, the host state government, and a bit more political movement on that. We do what we can on the ground, but those are very difficult circumstances. Second challenge we face, everyone faces, insufficient resources. There's never enough money, never enough capabilities and assets, and I could go on and on about the details of those in peacekeeping, but we need more of everything. And then finally, I just want to point out a current challenge we're facing is protection in peacekeeping transitions. So we see now that the Security Council has less of an appetite for peacekeeping. We're drawing down, we're exiting. We transitioned Haiti. We are in the process of closing Darfur, or transitioning it now. And the DRC mission will be changing soon. And in those contexts, we really need to keep protection of civilians, whatever we call it, at the top of the agenda, and really ensure that whatever peacekeeping has managed to achieve can be sustainable, can be maintained in whatever comes after a peacekeeping mission. So I'll just leave it there. And
thank you so much. That's fantastic.
So we're going to move from UN headquarters to the completely other side of the coin. Many of us in this room, I think, have watched with fascination what the organization called Nonviolent Peaceforce does in the realm of protection. So it's wonderful to have Tiffany here to reflect on that very much on the ground experience. So please.
Thank you. I'll squeeze.
You're welcome to it. Hi, everybody. Yes, it is the other end of the spectrum, really. I come from an operational NGO where we are working in the communities who are conflict affected, and it never ceases to amaze me when we have these conversations when we're talking about the POC agenda or the concept of POC, and I always wonder, why are we even talking about that? I'm revealing my hand as a humanitarian. If you're spending time in conflict affected communities, why else are we there? Is there any other reason to be there besides to protect each other, help each other protect themselves, help people protect themselves and each other in these times? So it's great that the normative framework has come a long, long way, and we have a long way to go, but there is a lot going on that has really moved the practice of the protection of civilians forward in a really concrete way in the last decade and a half. And so I'm happy to be able to talk about that. The work that we do is called unarmed civilian protection. So it's really effectively applied nonviolence. So we have teams that work in conflict-affected communities, and they're generally teams that are made of expat and local staff, so people from outside the country, people hired from the local community who are trained in the methodology of unarmed civilian protection, and their whole purpose is to interrupt cycles of violence. Our real focus is on the physical protection of civilians in conflict-affected areas as our starting point. And the reason I really emphasize that, and Regina talked about this, is that when we think about the protection of civilians, we still tend to default to this idea that protecting civilians requires force or the threat of force as the way to make us safer. That's true in our home lives. I mean, we're in Canada, and I am a proud Canadian, so it's a little bit less so here. Neighbors to the south have a different perspective. But certainly in conflict-affected areas, or when you hear about an area that's destabilizing, send in more troops, send in a regional force, send in the blue helmets, everything will be fine. And what we know from our work on the ground is it's a very small sliver of a tool that at times is needed. This is not a zero-sum game. These are complex situations we're working in. We need lots of tools, but it is only one tool, and it is very limited, and it's a bit of a blunt force instrument for very specific situations. Most situations require something much more nuanced, much more long-term, much less attached to a political agenda. So the work that we do, UCP, Unarmed Civilian Protection, is really about working with communities to use applied nonviolence, a whole set of tools and methodologies to interrupt cycles of violence, basically under two broad themes of work. We're looking at proactive and reactive work. So the reactive side is kind of the sexy side of protection. That's really when we're dealing with people at immediate risk. So we're working with human rights defenders, we're working with communities who are being targeted, maybe because of the geographical area they're living in, maybe it's disputed territory. We're working with groups of people who are being targeted because of their ethnic identities, really commonly working with groups of women who are being targeted for sexual violence as it relates to conflict, children who are being targeted, and we're working with whatever their specific identity is, whatever the specific place they are, and they're at threat, immediate threat of their physical safety. So we have a whole set of tools that we work with, things called protective accompaniment, strategic presence. We can do immediate shuttle diplomacy. In some cases, we can do interpositioning, and it's really about reducing that threat of violence in the immediate term. It's life-saving in its moment. So protection from harm, interrupting the thing that's going to happen now. So I'll give you an example, going back to the period that Regina was talking about, sort of the early onset time outbreak of the war in South Sudan. We were working in a town called Bentu, which went back and forth in terms of between the government forces several times in a period of a few weeks. So you can imagine there was constant fighting going on. Civilians were gathering in the protection of civilian sites. Some civilians were sheltering in the bush. Some were trying to remain somewhere in town, and the fighting would be ongoing, and they would be very reactionary to the fighting. So if they had tried to move out to their homes to collect their things, they'd heard fighting was going to happen, they would try to rush back into the protection of civilian sites, knowing fighting was going to start again. So we had to work in one of these areas where we were getting calls, fighting was imminent, we had known the forces were coming in, everybody was bunkering down, we were getting calls, and civilians were being held back at a checkpoint. And by the government forces. They were basically trying to set up a human shield. And we were getting calls because we knew the people there. We had such good relationships with the community. They were able to get messages through that they were being held back. And we were able to make decisions at that time. It's a very long story, which I don't have time to get into all of the details, but we were able to make decisions that included a security assessment, a quick analysis of, do we have the relationships we need? Do we know enough commanders? Do we know the men who are actually manning the checkpoints? Do we know the distance? Do we know how far away the soldiers are? Can we go out there and can we get them? Can we try and go out there and negotiate their release? We decided that we could, and we went out. We took one of our Land Cruisers, which should take about 13 people in it, and came back with about 30 women and children who had been held at this checkpoint. So it's very concrete, very in the moment, and that was very much about all of the things I just mentioned. We know the context, we know the patterns of fighting, we know the actual soldiers themselves by name, and we were able to go and use that space. We can't always do that. If we don't have all of those things in place, it would be too dangerous. We would be putting ourselves at risk, and we would not be able to make those people actually safer in the process. So that's really concrete in the moment reaction. The other side is the more proactive engagement, and this is where sort of that force protection really doesn't have what it takes to do the long yards, which is really digging down to root causes, really working with communities who have been affected by conflict, long-term, multi-generational conflict in many cases, where the idea that the use of violence has just become much more normalized than it was before that period of time. Weapons have been distributed more widely than they were, and the threat of force, war economies, all of these pieces have risen up around normal life. Violence has become quite normalized. And so we work with communities to try and get reconnected to what was already there in their cultural and historical past as it relates to conflict prevention, conflict management, and protection of civilians. None of that language community uses. That's all our very favorite humanitarian language that we like to use. For them, they would just call it dialogue or working things out like we would in our own homes. but help people really reconnect to what's already in their existing culture. Not with a peace colonial agenda, but with their own, drawing from their own experiences, and help reconnect to that and help de-link the idea that security and safety has to be attached to weapons, that it has to be attached to armed actors, that it is a more inclusive process, that it involves everybody in the community. It involves women, it involves men, it involves the elderly, it involves children and youth, and that we work together on the long game to try and to work on self-protection, so really from a community-based approach. So we do this work, and there's, it's the kind of work that, we talk about trying to prove preventing a negative. So this is one of the key challenges that we work with. Again, same like what Regina said, is we hear from the communities, we see evidence of people moving in ways that they feel safer and acting in ways that they feel safer. They will send their children to school if they feel safer. They will farm beyond their homes if they feel safer. They'll do all of these things so that's how we know it's working. Some of the challenges, however, and as the normative framework has really developed, and protection, to be honest, has become quite in vogue in the last few years. It's all everybody's talking about, which is good news. One of the challenges of the fact that it's become in vogue is when it came out, it was so carefully and narrowly defined in order to get through. And then there's been a period where it's getting a little bit watered down. And you hear this being said a lot. What is protection? It's everything, so it's nothing, which is really unfortunate, because it's a little bit, as something becomes more common and you hear the word more frequently, all the humanitarian organizations, development organizations, the UN, the diplomatic partners, everybody's talking about protection and putting their own spin on it. A few months ago, I was at NATO, and they were trying out their concept of POC. They're just catching up. And it was great to hear that they're thinking about the civilians on the ground. But you can see how this is happening. So that's one of the challenges, because we just focus on the protection of civilians. And when we hear this being sort of a watered down, mainstreaming, sort of let's do our checklists approach to protection, it makes us very nervous. It makes us very worried, because if you take the focus off violence reduction, if you take the focus off the fact that first and foremost, people need to be able to stay alive, to keep themselves from physical harm, and to protect their dignity in the process, then you don't have space to do anything else. So that's one of the key areas. And the other areas is that it's hard to broadly capture imagination around the use of nonviolence. Who can you name? Who do you know who's famous for nonviolence? Yes. Yes, very good. So this should be a good crowd. Who else? Who's used applied nonviolence? Who's the most famous person you know?
Gandhi.
Yes. Who else? Neighbors to the south. Yes. Right? Becomes a short list. And so we have this idea of these like great moments in history that's how I got into it. I was studying my master's. I'm like, this has to be replicable. It can't only be a couple of these people who've thought of doing this and have managed to spark the imagination. So that's one of the key. Violence is still powerful. Violence is still sexy. It's the thing that we are drawn towards. And it takes a lot more courage to go into an area where there's active conflict without the use of weapons, to build relationships, to build trust, to live and work alongside the communities, to build relationships with the actors, with the non-state armed actors, with the army, with the military actors, with the local government officials who may not really love that you're there. It takes a lot more courage to do that than it does to be able to think, okay, we've got all the weapons, you've got all the weapons, and let's have a standoff. We do a lot of our work, we have organizationally, we have two major goals. One is to do programming in the field, do as much of it as we can in as many places as we can to build up our practice and our skills around it. And the other piece of it is really to draw from what we've learned in the field and use it for advocacy. We want to challenge this paradigm, and that's already shifting, which is great. As we can see, the UN and everybody's starting to realize that it takes more than the threat of force to actually bring about sustainable peace. So one of the pieces of work that we do is really trying to bring evidence and examples from the work we do on the ground to show this is another way. It's another tool in our collective box that can really help to work on violence reduction and actually concretely, on a day-by-day basis, help civilians be safer and to be protected in the areas so that they can survive while these negotiations that can take months, more likely years, can come to an end. We also have a piece of research that an area of research that we're working on. There's a research network called the UCP Research Network, conveniently named. Lots of students in here may be looking for research topics, and we'd love to hear from you if you're interested. And we're really trying to build up the why does it work? What is the research around why does applied nonviolent work? When it does, when you have a relationship-based methodology, why does that work? What's the psychology in there? What's the physiology in there? What's the political implications? What are the inclusivity and gender normativity implications? So there's a whole body of work that we have a research group working on out in the field, drawing out what are the best practices, how can we replicate. So I will leave it at there for now and look forward to having further discussion with you.
I'm glad you put out the call for research, because one of my hidden agendas is always to inspire students to get excited about this as well. Can we wrap up with Federico? And I think he brings such an interesting perspective to this discussion in his current role with civilians in conflict, but given his positions that he's held in international organizations. And I think he's in a really good position to help us think through what advocacy's achieved as well in this context. So Federico, please.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Yes, Jennifer asked me to share with you what we think advocacy in the last 20 years has achieved in the field of protection of civilians. Let me first start by reminding ourselves how radical the concept of the protection of civilians is. If we look through human history, and if we look through military theory of the past thousands of years, civilians have always been a target in military operations, a legitimate target. You know, the proponents of IHL, of international humanitarian law, will point to the Greek king that in this year had an edict saying that civilians should be spared, an Indian warlord who said something similar about women. But the reality is that even in Western military theory, the need to break the will of the enemy by targeting its population is a concept that has been unchallenged until 1870 with the Franco-Prussian War, and then slowly to the Geneva Conventions of 1949. But if we look at the history of World War II, leaving aside the excesses of the Nazi, the targeting of civilians, you like to think of the bombing of Dresden or Hiroshima, was still considered a legitimate military tool. And my plea at the end, if I don't exceed my 14 minutes, is not to believe that this is now a given, that this is gone, because it can come back, and I think we see some of it coming back already. We see it in Syria, for example, where we've seen it. But so let me focus my remarks on civilian harm mitigation, which is the part of protection of civilians that Regina talked about, which is basically the principle that armed actors' own actions and operations do not harm civilians. Again, this was a concept that was entirely new. As the POC within the UN developed, a few years later, this concept started developing mostly in Afghanistan. And initially, through the work of our founder of Center for Civilians in Conflict, her name was Varla Ruzica, it took the form of what we know as amends for civilians. So, show of hands, who here believes that if the Canadian military, by mistake in Afghanistan, kills a civilian, and so a pressure came on NATO to change, and the US military to change these policies. And the pressure, we in the advocacy community like to think that it was us, Civic, the UN, also had its role, but really came from the Afghan government, from President Karzai, and from Afghan communities first and foremost. And there was gradually a recognition that this was not only the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do. And that's why civilian harm mitigation progressed so much in the past decade, because legal, ethical, and strategic arguments came together and coincided. A number of US military leaders like General McChrystal understood that every Afghan or Iraqi civilian killed meant 10 people joining the Taliban or whoever else. There's a lot of studies today from Afghanistan to Iraq to Nigeria to the Sahel that prove that the main reason that civilians join an armed group is because of violence against themselves or their families or their community. So because of this, because of this convergence, and also because of the advocacy community, obviously I don't want to downplay the role that we all play, but we have to be realistic that when we have to think about if and when these priorities don't converge. But when they did converge in Afghanistan, and then NATO started adopting a tool that is called civilian harm tracking, I can talk more about it, but it's basically a tool that enables a military force to investigate the harm it's causing to civilian and change its tactics accordingly. The civilian casualties caused by ICE have dramatically dropped. So it is possible military forces can take action and change their tactics so that less civilians are harmed. And based on the lessons of Afghanistan, these were taken, for example, to Somalia, where AMISOM, the African Union mission to Somalia, was also in trouble because it was killing a lot of civilians. And Human Rights Watch in 2010 published an article accusing them. And they were very frustrated, AMISOM officials, about this because they were applying whatever rules and regulations they had, and they did not understand why it happened. And successive in-depth analysis showed that indeed the rules of engagement of AMISOM were the problem, because Al-Shabaab would shoot at AMISOM from civilian areas, densely populated, and then flee. And AMISOM's rules were that if you're shot at, you shoot back. So they identified where the shooting came from, and they shot back and killed civilians. Then Shabaab would come back and tell civilians, you see, these foreigners are here to kill you. And it was the perfect strategy, and AMISOM had no idea that this was happening. And so when military actors went in, analyzed this, and told them to make changes, things got better. So these are just some of the examples. And then the next step, the next stage has been to take these lessons from this international, multinational context to the national level. And so my organization is engaged in places like Nigeria, Iraq, Mali, Afghanistan, Ukraine, etc., where we're working with both with local communities and local armed forces to try to identify what are the causes of harm to civilians and what they can actually do to reduce harm. We started work in Nigeria in 2015 doing research on the ground. And the main conclusion that our research showed was that the Nigerian military's mission was to destroy Boko Haram, not to protect civilians from Boko Haram. And that was the key problem, because if you're a military and your mission is to destroy, you will destroy and cause a lot of damage to civilians. If your mission is to protect civilians from a threat, you will still need to defeat Boko Haram because that's the threat. But the way you'll go about doing that will be different. So that's a kind of change in mindset that we are trying to help these militaries to get through. And at the same time, working directly with community, empowering them to create platforms for advocacy, helping them access their military, and helping them then gain concrete protection results from this interaction. And we've seen phenomenal results when the demand came directly from communities. So let me say, so this seems like that's a great picture, but it's not that great. And there are challenges, and I just want to get to those challenges before my 1-minute note shows up here. First is that we may be in the process of losing the champion of all this process. With all the controversies and problems, the United States government, Congress, and military has driven the civilian harm mitigation agenda over the past decades. Things have changed. If you've heard about that a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, and things have changed in the field of protection of civilians. And we've seen a number of small actions that were designed to basically reduce and take away those safeguards that had been put there before. The interesting, living in DC thing for me to see is to see that this has not been a straightforward process, because there has been a lot of resistance from some parts of the military and from some parts of Congress. And so it's still a battle that is being played out, and it may be temporary, but there are broader trends that may threaten this process. And I'll cite 4 that may seem to have nothing to do with each other, but I'll then conclude by telling you why I think they matter. The first is hybrid warfare. What we're seeing in Ukraine and Russia, and this kind of different information warfare and different ways of waging this low-level intensity of warfare that is deeply destabilizing. The second is cyber warfare. And one aspect, the key aspect of cyber warfare when it comes to protection for me is that it's extremely difficult to attribute who launched that attack. The third one is autonomous weapons. And the fourth, 1 minute, perfect.
1 minute.
Yes, I was expecting that. And then the fourth is the increasing use of proxies to fight wars. Whether it's local militaries, local armed groups, mercenary groups, like some of you may have heard of the Wagner group, a Russian mercenary group that is lethal and is operating in several contexts. What do all these trends that seem to have nothing to do with each other, why do I connect them? Because they all have one thing in common, the diffusion of responsibility and the plausible deniability of who is actually conducting that military operations, right? And therefore, with less accountability, it's going to be much more difficult to engage when you don't know who to engage, or when you know, but they deny it, right? Many of us who worked on Congo have spent a decade with this wall of denial from Rwanda. We have nothing to do with Eastern Congo. It was impossible to have a single meeting with them because it was just the same answer. Like, this is our neighbors. We don't know what they're talking about. But your army was there. No, it wasn't our army. So as if warfare is making this more and more easy, that's going to be a challenge for us. And that may mean that the strategic argument that I talked about before may not coincide anymore with the legal and humanitarian. And therefore, we're going to have to see if the legal and the humanitarian arguments that are strong, I'm sure, for everyone in this community, are strong enough outside of it. And we've already seen, for example, and I'll conclude there, in the battle for Mosul, how this has become a bit shaky with a lot of both US and Iraqi military personnel arguing for hitting super hard ISIS because if you destroy ISIS quickly, then you're going to save more civilians. And the argument was really, if we kill most of the civilians in Mosul, but we do it in 2 weeks instead of a battle for 5 months, that will protect more civilians in the future. But it's a flawed argument. So, as students who are going to come, into the professional world, look at these trends. Look at this. When you see it's time to take the gloves off, know that this means that probably not a good thing, because these trends will continue to play out. This battle of ideas over protection versus civilians as targets will continue to be there. Thank you. I think I've exceeded even the 1 minute.
Wonderful. I'm so thankful to the panelists for giving us, I think, 2 things that helps us to reflect on 20 years. One is just a sense of the vast array of actors who are part of different aspects of this agenda. So this is about changing behavior in terms of the diplomatic community and what is normal for the UN Security Council. It's about changing the behavior of national militaries. It's about changing the behavior of UN peacekeepers and the Secretariat. And it's about changing the behavior of communities on the ground. So we really got a sense of that. But I think some really frank reflections on what's working and what's not.